My name is Evelyn Chung, and I'm one of the co-vice chairs of the MCCPTA Gifted Education Committee. The Gifted Education Committee supports and advocates on behalf of children of all backgrounds who require accelerated and enriched instruction beyond the grade level curriculum in order to achieve at their highest level. We seek to increase public awareness of the special needs of GT learners and to assist their families along their educational journey in order to ensure that they are identified and challenged. We are liaisons between MCPS staff and families from local schools where appropriate to advocate for GT and highly able learners within MCPS in compliance with various MCPS policies, Maryland statute, and regulations. We are not a part of the MCPS. This is not a representation by the MCPS. The Montgomery County of Parent-Teacher Associations is the umbrella organizations for your local PTA. And we advocate at the county level and provide programming at the county level. So today's presentation is actually a redo of a presentation we gave at an MCCPTA Family Engagement Night. We were unable to record that presentation because of timing issues and because our presentation hadn't been fully reviewed and edited. And so in an effort to try to reach as many parents and guardians as possible and provide information in many different forms to parents and guardians, we are recording this presentation and we'll try to provide translations in various languages. If there is a language other than Spanish, Chinese, or Amharic, please let us know if you would like to have a translation in another language. Thank you. Just to again state, we are not MCPS, and this presentation has not been vetted or approved by MCPS. We are simply parent volunteers who created this presentation based on information that we've researched on our own in an effort to educate and empower parents and guardians. Again, we will be offering this recording and with computer-generated subtitled translations. So what will we be talking about in today's presentation? First, this is a very broad overview. This presentation is really geared towards those of you who are new to MCPS and probably more geared towards elementary and maybe middle school parents. For more details after you watch this, please do attend our Gifted Education Committee events and join us on Facebook. We have a growing and really collaborative and collegial community of parents who share information, who can ask questions of each other. And we really feel that parents can often be the best source of information from parent to parent. Today, we are just going to address some myths about giftedness and answer the following questions that we often get. 1, what is giftedness and how does the Montgomery County Public Schools identify it? 2, what is gifted education and how can MCPS meet the needs of gifted students at each grade level? And 3, how can I advocate for my child and for gifted programs to my school and to MCPS as a whole? So the first myth that I'd like to address is that there is no definition for giftedness. We get a lot of questions from folks in the community who say that, all children have gifts, can't you use a different word? And we on the GEC completely agree that all children have unique gifts and potential that MCPS should be helping to identify and cultivate. But when we as a committee talk about giftedness, we actually are talking about a very specific term of art that has been codified in the Maryland state law and has a specific meaning and rights and programs attached to it in a similar way to the way that the word disabilities or learning disabilities does have in the educational context. The definition of gifted and talented comes from the Maryland statute, actually. And actually before that, there is a federal statute out there, but it doesn't really have any kind of enforcement or funding attached to it right now. But currently the Maryland statute is the relevant one, and it defines a gifted and talented student as an elementary or secondary student who is identified by professionally qualified individuals as having outstanding talent and performing or showing the potential for performing at remarkably high levels of accomplishment when compared with other students of a similar age, experience, or environment. They could also be exhibiting high performance capability in intellectual, creative, or artistic areas. They could possess an unusual leadership capacity or excel in specific academic fields. So some things to note in this definition. The identification of the gifted and talented student must be identified by a professionally qualified individual. So it can't just be like every parent thinks that their child falls in this definition. An actual professional has to do this identification process. It doesn't include things like athletics, for example, which obviously there are students who are gifted in athletics and in sports, but it really focuses on this intellectual, creative, or artistic area. As well, the language specifically talks about showing the potential for performing at a high level. So the definition of gifted and talented specifically contemplates a child who has high potential but may not actually be achieving at a high level yet. What often folks don't realize too is that there is a regulation under Maryland state law that provides for the identification of gifted students. So COMAR, which is a kind of abbreviation for the Maryland Code of Maryland Regulations, require local systems to establish an equitable process for identifying gifted and talented students. The state has to approve this process each year, or the school system can use the model process. So in this presentation, which we'll link to the actual slide deck, whenever you see something in green, that means that there's a link. So you can click on it and actually read the statute. You can also click on it and see what the Maryland model of gifted and talented education is. MCPS does have its own gifted education plan and identification plan, and that changes every year. We are actively trying to have MCPS publish it on their website. It's reported through the ESSA plan. So it is a little bit different, and it does change from year to year. But the statute actually has certain requirements that must be met by all gifted identification plans. First, gifted identification must be conducted through a universal screening. In other words, the identification pool has to include all students, and all students must be screened. At least 10% of students in the local school system must be identified as gifted. So note that's not each school, it's the local school system. And multiple indicators of potential ability and achievement from an annually reviewed Maryland State Department of Education approved list of assessments and checklists must be used. So again, there are these sort of expert vetted assessment indicators that are allowed, that the Maryland State allows school systems to use. And please note that it's not just one indicator. What experts and the Maryland Code do not want is to have there be just one data point that determines whether a student is going to be identified as gifted or not. There must be multiple indicators. The process must be in writing, made public, and consistently implemented system-wide. And for pre-K through 2, early indicators of giftedness must be documented. As well, the code also provides for ongoing professional learning for teachers in identification procedures, characteristics, as well as the academic and social emotional needs of gifted and talented students. So here's a list of the Msde approved assessments and some examples. There are cognitive ability assessments, which measure the potential of a student, not whether or not they have achievement. And you'll see included are assessments such as the COGAT, which MCPS has historically used since 2018, but not recently. The WISC, which you may be familiar with if you are applying to certain other programs, and the Stanford Binet, which some other states use. There are aptitude and achievement assessments, such as the MAP, the PARCC test, the MCAP, SAT, and SCAT. As well, there's alternative assessments, which, as far as I'm aware, MCPS does not use. That's the Torrance test of creativity, access for ELLs. But you might find that some of these tests are used by outside private consultants. There are also behavioral checklists that should be filled out by parents, teachers, and sometimes another staff member, as well as supplemental information like art portfolios and performances are also approved by Maryland for use in these gifted and talented programs. And I believe that would probably be more appropriate for something like a high school arts program. So how does MCPS identify its gifted students? So the process is called the Student Instructional Program Planning and Implementation, or SIPI identification, and it occurs in the 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 7th grade. It's really important to understand that SIPI identification is not the same as being selected for the Center for Enriched Studies, a middle school magnet, or for accelerated and enriched courses. So the criteria may be different, and it often is. However, especially in the early years, SIPI identification might be your first official notice from MCPS that your child is entitled to opportunities for enrichment and or acceleration. So in the June of your 2nd grade, parents will receive a letter that includes their students' gifted and talented identification designation. Also, MCPS will be required to start reporting the numbers of gifted students in each school in their annual report card. So for purposes of overall gifted advocacy and monitoring how many students are identified throughout the system, the SIPI process does have importance. Whether it actually aligns with receiving services from MCPS is a different question. So here's the SIPI identification criteria. Again, for the most updated information, since it does change annually, click on this link and look on the MCPS website. But understand that it did change during the pandemic because of pandemic concerns, and a lot of the data maybe wasn't the same as it was in the past years. But generally, for 2021-2022, MCPS looked at 3 academic measures plus, could you qualify as gifted talented if you met 3 academic measures plus a behavioral checklist, or if you met 4 academic measures. So academic measures would include the Winter Map R, the Winter Map M, benchmark or study sync, interim 2 marking period, interim 2 assessment, the Eureka Learn Zillion Math 2 marking period, 2nd marking period assessment. Behavior checklists include the parent intake form, home of teacher survey, or staff advocacy survey. Note that for the SIPI identification process, the national norms were used. Alternative data sources are generally not used by MCPS, but if the student has not been previously identified as DT by MCPS, they will also consider outside cognitive ability assessments or prior designation by another school district. So what that means is, parents would be able to provide an outside cognitive ability assessment. Let's say that their child had taken a WISC or did a full, psychoevaluation, educational evaluation by a professional. MCPS could consider that information. That is also important for those who are coming from outside of the school system. So again, this data is also used for the Every Student Succeeds Act report, which requires, in which Maryland requires schools to report not only their gifted identification process, but the number of gifted students identified in each school, the percentage identified in each school, and as well as a continuum of programs and services, and goals, targets, strategies, and timelines. I just wanted to also have this information for parents whose children may be eligible for rescreening. So that would be if the student was not identified as GT, but we're very close to meeting the requirements. The MCPS could be recommend a student for rescreening, and at certain points, I think there were opportunities to request that rescreening. So one thing that we want to highlight too is that previously MCPS used cognitive abilities tests. So that would have been something like InView or Raven. And in 2008, they replaced the prior test with the COGAT, first down county and then up county. And they tested every second grader with the COGAT. Actually, this slide is not correct. I have to update it. But the 3rd and 5th graders, I think, were only tested after the first initial review. And then it was recommended, or like that certain students test for the COGAT, and then parents could also opt in for the COGAT. The COGAT included verbal and quantitative assessments, but importantly, it also included nonverbal assessments, funny shapes and patterns. I'm not really an expert, to be honest, just a parent, but it's a lot of visual things. Harder for people to have students to have seen before. Probably it's not likely that a student has seen it before. And these nonverbal assessments also help identify gifted ESOL students or English language learners. The COGAT was never the only factor used by MCPS and is not required to be identified as gifted, but was one of multiple factors used to identify high potential students. In January 2020, MCPS began considering eliminating the COGAT. They were able to administer the test to 3rd, 5th, and 8th graders in 2020 before school shut down for the pandemic. 2nd graders, however, did not get tested in spring 2020 because distance learning had begun. In the school year 2020 to 2021 and 2021 to 2022, MCPS did not administer the COGAT. And MCPS has already stated their intention that they will not administer the COGAT next year, 2022 to 2023, and instead will use these 3 years as a pilot. However, they have not explained what they are assessing during this pilot, or how they really can do an assessment if they don't have information on which students would have been identified with the COGAT or without. Now, keep in mind, again, that they've been using the COGAT since 2018, and before the pandemic, they had plenty of data that they could review to determine whether or not using the COGAT identified the same students or different students than not using it. And in our brief review of the data that we have from 2018, which is only Down County data, it does appear that in pretty much every school, but most schools or middle schools, using the COGAT would have identified more students than not using the COGAT. In other words, that there were some students that would not have made the cutoff for being identified as GT based on achievement tests alone. So our concern, and we have raised this to MCPS, is that eliminating a cognitive ability test of any kind as one of the multiple factors for GT identification is problematic, especially in a year when math scores have declined by about 30 to 40%, when students really struggled, and that gifted students were not immune to the psychological and other stresses of distance learning and the pandemic. But they were not immune to losing a family member to COVID or other emotional impacts during that time. And we have heard from parents whose children, for example, were identified as gifted in 3rd grade, but due to the pandemic suffered grade declines or declines in the math, or had trouble really taking a math exam after a year and a half out of school in person. So we are very concerned that the purpose of GT identification is not being met without a cognitive ability exam at some point during a child's educational journey. That we understand why it was skipped during the distance learning, but we do feel that MCPS should, at some point administer the exam for particularly the classes that completely have missed the COGAT, which is this year's 4th graders and I believe the 3rd graders as well. So again, I just want to reiterate here, this is quotes from the Maryland COMAR and regulation, which specifically state that being gifted and talented includes students who have the potential for performing at high levels of accomplishment, not just those who have already achieved that high level. And as well, the regulation also requires the use of multiple indicators of potential, ability, and achievement from the MSDE's checklist. So, we don't see from this checklist the measures of potential. We don't see from MCPS's process where they are measuring potential and ability, not just ability and achievement. So the second myth that this alludes to is that all gifted students have straight A's and high math scores. Again, this is simply, not true. In fact, what I'm going to do is just quote from MCPS's website, there is plenty of research that shows that gifted students need specific, supports often in terms of like the academic programming, social emotional support, in order to really thrive. And so MCPS itself has stated these beliefs must be dispelled. We know that gifted students who are not challenged and guided may lose interest, perform poorly, and even discontinue their study. We know that academic underachievement can be reversed and talented students identified among former underachievers. Finally, equal opportunity is not synonymous with having the same experiences. Every child should be given maximum challenge, support, and guidance in the learning process, but the nature of these may be quite different from child to child. So I'm quote as much as I can from MCPS because I feel that MCPS has done a good job of doing the research in this area and knows the studies out there about gifted students. And so as a parent advocating for your child, we should just cut that conversation short. It's just a myth that gifted students can thrive on their own. We know that, for many, they need the right circumstances in terms of how much challenge and guidance they have in order to really, really reach their full potential. And that also brings us to myth number 3, which is that students with learning disabilities can be gifted too. And this one I really think is a myth that people are not aware is a myth. And so I want to take a moment I'm not an expert in this, but I do want to highlight some things. Montgomery County actually is one of the first school systems to recognize that there are twice exceptional or 2E children, which are gifted students with disabilities, and try to create some programming for this and an identification procedures. That said, there's still obviously always room for improvement, and MCPS has committed to meeting the needs of its gifted students with disabilities, but it is very hard to identify these students often because the giftedness can mask the learning disability and vice versa. So I have linked to a number of resources. There's this great handbook on the website that I would recommend linking and really reading if you think your child might be twice exceptional. And as well, link to different programs. For example, there is a dedicated center for 2E students, the Lucy Bardsley Center, and a checklist that I think is really helpful for parents and not just teachers and staff. So I'm going to, it's not an exhaustive list, but I pulled this from the handbook because I think as a parent, it can be kind of hard to realize that maybe your child might need to be screened for twice exceptionality. So I wanted to give some examples of profiles that do come up that are specifically mentioned in the handbook. So for example, you can have a child who's gifted with a specific learning disorder, such as being gifted with dyslexia. You can have a student who's gifted with ADHD. So they might struggle with organization, executive functioning, working memory, processing speed, and written expression. Sort of consistently inconsistent is a term that's often used. However, still be gifted. And this one is very hard to identify because many common behaviors of gifted children can be misinterpreted as symptoms of attention problem, intensity, drive, perfectionism, impatience, oppositionality, hyperactivity, and it's really hard to distinguish the two without professional consultation. Next, there's also gifted students with autism. Again, this can be difficult to identify because there are overlapping characteristics such as intensity and divergent thinking. I found this sort of useful, so I copied and pasted it from the MCPS handbook. They are, again, common 2E characteristics. And when I say common, I'm not saying there's a lot of students like this, but if you are reading these profiles and some of it sounds familiar, it might be a good time to reach out to MCPS. They have a 2E specialist in the Accelerated Enrichment Instruction Unit, and reach out to a teacher, do some reading, and explore this a little bit more. So, for example, you might have a student who exhibits superior reasoning, both verbal and nonverbal, is creative, curious, and driven to learn, but has difficulties organizing thinking materials or times. They make great connections, have really strong problem solving or critical thinking capabilities. but have processing, memory, or executive functioning difficulties. In writing, you can have a student who is really creative, has great ideas, and orally has a very large and advanced vocabulary and a strong voice in their writing. They're really verbally elaborate. They're young children who add like unlimited description and detail. And yet they might have certain difficulties in the mechanics of writing, of handwriting, or fine motor difficulties. Or they may have difficulty with conventions, sense, paragraph structure, grammar, and usage. So that would be an example of somebody who is gifted, but may actually have really specific disabilities. Maybe it's a motor function issue, or maybe it's something else, right? Likewise with reading, you can have a student with really advanced reading comprehension skills when expressed orally or when read to, and they can answer higher level thinking and metacognitive type reading comprehension questions orally, but have difficulties understanding text when reading independently. And they may have decoding and fluency needs. These are some examples of social emotional traits of some 2E learners, where they can often express frustration, anxiety, or self-esteem. There will be kind of an cognitive and academic dissonance. So you may see class clown behaviors on your gifted student, disruptive behaviors. One thing that could happen is that a child who, for example, let's say the child has a really gifted creative mind and so many complex thoughts, and they're coming in really quickly and they want to express them, but they have trouble with the motor coordination with their handwriting, or they have some other kind of disability. They are going to feel really frustrated because they can't get those words down on paper. And so there are accommodations for this type of situation. They could have special occupational therapy for their hands, but they can also, as they progress, learn how to type, and that might help that student be able to express themselves, but get past the mechanical difficulties. So that's just one example. There are plenty. Okay, and examples for math, you can have a student who's a strong mathematical thinker, can grasp taught concepts quickly, but have difficulties with basic facts. So on March 23rd, this is 2022 at 8 p.m., we will have a special joint presentation by the Gifted Education Committee and the Special Education Committee on twice exceptional learners. And we are very excited to have MCPS's own twice exceptional instructional specialist, Sarah Jackson, present and answer questions. Myth number 4 is that gifted students can learn on their own and need no guidance. Although I'm sure you all have already kind of alluded to this before. So here's where I think it's really helpful to see how the MCPS Board of Education Policy IOA frames what gifted education should look like. And here's a link too. The policy IOA talks about gifted education in sort of 3 different ways. The first is acceleration, the second is enrichment, and the third are grouping practices. So as a parent, think about that as you consider whether your child's needs are being met. Acceleration can mean that students are given a curriculum that is at a higher level, above grade level 1 or 2 or more grade levels above the regular curriculum. And also can mean that the information is more complex, or that more information is covered, and that the materials is presented more rapidly than in typical instruction. Students are confronted by a greater challenge than is customary with on-grade level material. So the pacing piece of it is something that a lot of parents and teachers don't recognize until they see it in action. So you might have a student that is in a regular class and the pacing is just too slow for a gifted learner. And so for some students, speeding up the pace would be very stressful, and that would not be appropriate. But for a gifted learner, in order for them to stay engaged in the class, they actually need that fast-paced learning. And so that is what, for example, Centers for Studies do. They actually increase the pacing of the learning, as well as accelerating and providing above grade level instruction. And likewise, that is the thinking behind, let's say, a compacted math class, is that you're actually compacting the material of 2 grades into 1, and you're not skipping a whole lot. You may skip a little bit, but you generally are covering the material, but you're covering it at a much faster pace. And then eventually the student also is learning material at above grade level, above the grade level. Then there's enrichment, and that is the opportunity to learn in greater depth and breadth. So that may include, but is not limited to, complexity of content that allows students to pursue topics of interest and selection in depth with research and analysis. There's an emphasis on thinking that requires comparisons and analogies and using information gained in ways that apply and transform the knowledge. So that would be like a lot more deeper discussion and critical analysis of readings, let's say, or thinking about math in a much more conceptual way and linking different concepts, and also creating original and creative products resulting from in-depth knowledge and reflection. So that's analysis, but it also often aligns with project-based learning. Third, we have grouping practices. And the policy states that schools will make classroom assignments and ensure that children who are achieving at the highest level are not isolated from each other. And this, again, is very important. So whether or not you have a class that is mixed ability, you still want to have a sufficient number of students so that that gifted learner is not feeling isolated and has enough students to really engage in, what a kind of projects and team projects and analysis at their above grade level, and that they don't feel alone. If they're giving accelerated content, like more work, that they don't feel like they're just kind of being penalized for finishing their work quickly, but that they have other peers who are also doing that. So they're all in it together, because that student may actually prefer the faster pace, but when in a classroom setting, when they're the only ones being singled out to have extra work, that is not a comfortable feeling for that child. They may just sort of feel like they're being penalized for being quicker. And we'll go on to, we'll talk a little bit about the social emotional needs of a gifted student, but the grouping practices are also important so that the child does not feel socially isolated or that they don't fit in. They really benefit from having peers who share their motivation and their kind of unique way of thinking. So this is the COMAR requirements for programs and services that must be offered to gifted learners. Each school system shall provide different services beyond those normally provided by the regular school program in order to develop the gifted and talented students' potential. So that includes differentiated, evidence-based programs and services that accelerate, extend, or enrich instructional content, strategies, and products. There should be a continuum of appropriately differentiated curriculum and programs, and then they must be during the school day, regular school day. Sometimes schools will say, well, we have this after school math club or robotics, but not every family can either afford these programs or can actually have their student even stay after school. And gifted students are entitled to have differentiation during the school day and have their needs met in the same way as every other child. So in addition, COMAR actually provides for programs and services to support the social and emotional growth of their gifted and talented students. So, I think sometimes gifted education is considered kind of an extra that is not a need to have. And often it's perceived as being kind of an elitist thing that only, affluent parents care about. However, the consequences of failing to provide gifted education through the public school system in the way that is contemplated by the statute is actually inequities and disparities, as well as long-term underachievement, particularly to those who don't have access to outside resources and can't supplement outside of the school day. And when programs are available, MCPS's own studies have shown that you can actually improve the achievement of students with high potential. And so I'm going to specifically link to MCPS studies because sometimes there's plenty of national research about how gifted programs can really help students, but what's important is what's actually happening in our own school system, right? And are the programs that MCPS offers succeeding in that goal? So one is an Office for School of Accountability Analysis. Here's a link that shows that certain structured AP and IB programs that require a certain number of AP or IB courses helped maintain the high achievement of advanced level Black and Brown students from 8th grade to graduation. Likewise, there is an OSA analysis that shows that one elementary program, which is enriched literacy curriculum, and a middle school program, which is the historical inquiries classes. Oh, and I should have mentioned there's also applied AM, can actually increase the academic growth among gifted students. And these are programs offered at the local schools. So now we come to this myth, number 5, which is that gifted education is just about curriculum and academics. Oh, sorry. I skipped a slide. So I will just go through this. I just wanted to add that in addition to the other requirements for curriculum, the policy IOA and Maryland COMAR do require that teachers and principals be professionally trained and that trainings be offered regularly and monitored. So sorry, going back to our slide regarding the social emotional needs of gifted students. I will not go into this too much depth. Again, this is sort of an introductory presentation, but they do have special social emotional needs along with their academic needs, such as they often exhibit intensity and idealism, asynchrony, difference in their age versus their academic, their sort of internal mindset, difficulty fitting in, and there's intersectionality here too. The experience of a gifted child who may be different, and the social impacts may be amplified depending on the child's race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, special education status, and so on and so forth. So these are links to a presentation that was done some years ago on the social emotional needs of gifted children, as well as some YouTube videos on gifted children and depression and how to spot depression in gifted. Again, there is often a disconnect and frustration by children by having an intellect that is miles ahead of their physical self in their educational setting. If they feel socially isolated, that can have the same impact on children that other kinds of social isolation can have. And they may lack the emotional coping skills to process their big feelings and rich inner life. There actually is the potential for gifted students to have existential crises at a younger age, which parents and teachers may not recognize because the child seems so young. So as a parent of a gifted child, these videos and resources can be really helpful. Okay, so now what a lot of parents want to hear about is, now that you understand the big picture and what the statutes and policies say your child is supposed to have, how do you find out more about what's available to your child? So here are some links to other presentations that MCCPTA Gifted Education Committee have put together. One is on elementary school ELA, and the other is on math. This is not updated. We'll update it on the slide deck that will be linked. We also have links to helpful questions to ask your child's teacher during the parent-teacher conference in elementary school. And here's this chart that we created, because this is very confusing in MCPS. People don't understand where to go in central office, and you're not alone in that. Part of the difficulty is that actually they do change organizational structure from year to year. It's changed every few years for as long as I've been doing this. And the names change sometimes too. But right now, this is what the org chart looks like of people and offices that are relevant to your advocacy as a parent or guardian of a gifted child. At the top is the Office of Teaching, Learning, and Schools, which is run by Chief Rochelle Rubin. Below OTLS is OSIP, the Office of Curriculum and Instructional Programs, as well as another branch, and this is important, of the Associate Superintendents of School Support and Improvement. So that's OSSI. And depending on your area and cluster, and I'll link to a chart of which cluster you're in, you have a different associate superintendent. And under those associate superintendents are the directors of learning achievement and administration. and under that is your child's school and your child's principal. So this is important because OSIP has under their umbrella college and career readiness and district-wide programs, which under Director Scott Murphy is the Accelerated Enrichment Instruction Unit, which has acting program supervisor Deborah Muggy, as well as DCAPS, which is in charge of, COGAT, the center, and magnet selection processes, as well as another branch under Keisha Logan, which is curriculum. So curriculum comes up with a curriculum for on-grade level courses. AEI helps work on enrichment and acceleration resources, and is a resource to the parents of gifted learners. And this branch is, there to support schools and teachers and parents in developing curriculum, developing trainings, and providing professional development to teachers of gifted students. However, OSSI is responsible for actually making sure that implementation occurs at the school level. So when you're advocating, it's really important to, yes, talk to the folks in these offices to find out what is available for your child, and they can be really helpful to support you in your journey. But you also want to make sure you're talking to the OSSI folks, because those are the folks that can actually work with your principal to make sure that your child's needs are met at the school level. This is probably copyrighted, so I apologize. MCPS Contacts. These are, every elementary school has a GT liaison. So this is an MCPS personnel. It's usually the associate principal in your school who's responsible for helping parents kind of through this process, right, and understand what is available. And every middle school has an AEIST. So this link on the slide deck that we'll distribute provides a roster of who the GT liaison is, or the AEIST in your school, and they are your first resource other than your child's teacher. We do note that your elementary school's math and reading specialists will have a lot more information about enrichment, reading, and math. Likewise at the middle school level, for your English specialist, your social studies specialist, your math specialist. So it can help to go to them as well. In addition, the Accelerated Enrichment Instruction Specialist, the central office, can provide information and advice, and here's their telephone and email address. Curriculum specialists also provide information about the on-grade level curriculum. And in some cases, like math, they also provide information on, let's say, the compacted math curriculum. And in addition, this is a directory for FY22 of leadership in these different offices. If you find the need to go up the advocacy ladder for a very specific issue relating to your child and your child's school, this is the link to the various OSSI teams. We have created some additional materials which we will link, including a document called Know Your Rights, in which I explain a lot of the same things that I explained in this presentation, and providing citations for COMAR, Policy IOA, Regulation IOA RA. Your advocacy ladder begins with your teacher, then your school, and maybe your GT liaison or AEIST. And then it should then to your principal, director. You should also try to include AEI for background advice, and you may want to contact your MCCPTA cluster coordinator for help. Or of course, you can ask us, Gifted Education Committee, to help. We also have a listserv and a Facebook, so you can reach out to other parents for advice as well. When concerns and complaints don't get addressed to your satisfaction, there is a process called the public complaint. This is little known. Your principal actually is obligated to tell you about this option and provide you with a form and a copy of the regulation KLA RA. We can assist you with that as well. So here's information. Please do stay in touch. I've linked to a resources page that has a lot more resources, and we're constantly updating that. Just want to identify the rest of the committee. We have Audra Dove, who's our chair. I'm the co-vice chair, and Anna Campante is a co-vice chair as well. We also have a number of other terrific volunteers on our committee. We have math leads, we have folks helping us with science, and we are always looking for more volunteers for discrete projects and those who want to get really more involved. This is our email address, our Facebook group link. We really strongly recommend that you join us there. And again, some links to recent budget testimonies I'm happy to see. We do hope to do more of these recordings and presentations to let people know about different advocacy that we've been doing and what we've been doing as a committee. We do a lot of outreach because we want to expand our committee and make sure we're reaching all parts of the counties, all schools in the county. And we strongly urge parents to sign up as a GT liaison for the local PTA, and that would make you part of our committee. You would be given, information and guidance to help you spread the word to your school, but also get, you can get advice for your own child as well. So thank you for joining us. This is the first of what we hope will be multiple recordings. Linked along with this YouTube recording is our slide deck, which will have some corrections.